my involvement with View Royal over an open fiber optic network, and I'm participating as a volunteer and a private citizen in that task, although I do public policy work in that area, nationally and internationally, came about as a consequence of a word that began the morning, and that's conversations. I was in this room for an E&M Railroad trail presentation, and I met Emmett for the first time. I said, while you're putting in that trail, you got to run fiber optic cable along it. And he said, funny you should say that, because I'm going to do that. And so my whole involvement with View Royal over that question came from that. Now, earlier this week, on Tuesday, the council has decided to go ahead and set up a View Royal task force that will draft a strategy for a fiber optic network in View Royal, an open fiber optic network, and I'll explain what that means, as a public utility. So this is now a View Royal decision, and we're moving in that direction. Next slide. The objective that we have for purpose of discussion going into this task force is to achieve socioeconomic benefit for View Royal from participation in the internet economy by growing over time an open fiber optic network as a municipally owned public utility. The objective is significant in that it focuses on socioeconomic development and not on technology. And I think you'll see by the time I've wandered across a whole range of issues that that's the key question. And when Graham Hill was speaking to us all this morning, and he identified that a network is central to View Royal's sense of its own economic development, I was happy to hear that, because there's someone in the political process who's identifying what the functional purpose of a network actually is. So I'm talking about infrastructure here, and I'm talking about the fact that infrastructure costs money, but I'm hoping to convince you that at its heart, it's really public policy about socioeconomic development. And also that it has some significant connections to the implementation of green infrastructure. View Royal, or any municipality now, is part of a global internet economy. And that's a phrase the OECD is using to describe the kind of world we're in now, not an information society, but an internet economy. And that means that any place on Earth is now both local and global at the same time. It also means that a significant shift in the way in which local governments and citizens think about development is underway. And an open network in a community allows us to control our development in ways that we couldn't do it everywhere. And there are now many municipalities in North America who are coming to the conclusion that they have to have that. Next slide. So anyway, in that objective, I think that leaves me with the task over the rest of my presentation of saying something about the link between municipal networks and green infrastructure, or the internet and green infrastructure. I have to define what an internet economy is, and I have to define what a network is as open, fiber optic, and municipal. And then I'll briefly talk about the task that the task force for View Royal faces. Green infrastructure, next slide. Big fat word, dematerialization, or the replacement of atoms with bits. The internet allows us, is part of something called ICTs, or information and communications technologies. And that's a phrase that comes out of the development community, and they talk about the uses of ICTs for development, is the key phrase, which you'll hear internationally all the time, but not so much in Canada for some reason. In terms of replacing atoms with bits, we can't really see the upper limits and how much of that you can actually do. And if you recall in the energy sector, the concept of least cost end use, it's kind of that approach to the design of almost everything. By replacing the substance of things with embedded knowledge about what those things actually are. So two things happen. We gain a greater sense of how systems work. And we had a wonderful example of that earlier in the day when we saw the transportation model for View Royal. People, citizens of View Royal can ask what-if questions of their own landscape and see the consequences of that in real time. So you can use ICTs in that sense. But the other thing is, in the sense of a smart building, one that senses its own environment and can use its feedback regulatory loops to intelligently reduce its energy uses, things become more knowledgeable in that sense too. And the next phase of the internet, as I think many of you are aware, isn't just the intensification of personal take-up of it. It's the way in which the internet will be embedded in things, and things will talk to things. Next slide. The dematerialization allows you to do a whole bunch of things. And I'm not going to speak to these individually. I've just referenced smart buildings. Obviously, ICT use in monitoring climate change. There are complex models of the world's climate, the relationship of land to sea, and things like that, that allow us to understand our relationship with the planet much better. One of the keys in this list, however, of the way in which ICTs can be used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is the last one. The fact is, the more we use ICTs, the more electricity they demand. There's a huge industry beginning to grow up to figure out how we can make them themselves smarter about their own energy use. Next slide. Those factors that were on the previous list are also embedded in this list. And this is from a Canary, which is the Canadian Internet Backbone Organization, presentation on ICTs and green infrastructure. It's showing an analysis that was done by the European Commission on how much virtualization can actually make a difference. And as you see, they show that ICT growth, the use in ICT growth, in fact, increases the carbon impact, the carbon footprint, and is offset by other things. But the net gain in using ICTs for dematerialization of things, in the way in which I defined it, is a gain. And in the next slide, this gentleman, whose name I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, produced this slide several years ago for the government of Japan. And Japan is a nation state that has a well-developed strategy for the uses of ICTs for development. And in particular for attacking their reduction of carbon. And in his analysis, again using the same factors down the outside that you would apply to dematerialize things, he determined that for their Kyoto target, as it was set in, can anybody see what the date is in here? I think it was 2003. The Kyoto target they had set for themselves then. Simply by the use of ICTs for dematerialization, they could realize 90% of their Kyoto target. So the use of the internet for these things, or the uses of ICTs, is significant. Next slide. Here's why Japan is confident that they can actually proceed with that. Japan currently is the country on the far left with the highest broadband capacity on Earth. The average person's broadband capacity is 60 megabytes a second. My broadband capacity over here in Aldersmith Place, courtesy of TELUS, back to you would be 0.7 of a megabyte. So in Canada, it's way down on that list, approximately 6, and of course that adds in all of the TV, cable, internet-based stuff, and all the use across the country. So the ordinary citizen doesn't have anywhere near 6. Canada, or Japan can adopt a strategy like that because they're headed in that direction. But I don't think that, unless the municipalities step up to the plate, that Canada is going to be able to follow Japan's example anytime soon. And I'm going to turn to